Good morning and welcome to the channel. This is Kevin with Hooked on Vets coming at you from San Antonio here in South Texas. Another hot day. Hey, if this is your first time visiting the channel, a special welcome to you. Today we are installing a brand new water pump and 160-degree thermostat, my 2005 C6 with an LS2 engine as promised. But first I want to show you guys some of the stuff that we got in the mail here recently. Is in the last couple of vlogs I told you that we have been ordering a bunch of parts because we are going to be upgrading this vet with a number of bolt-on mods, starting with the water pump and the thermostat. But from there, we are also going to be doing some aesthetic mods, adding some carbon fiber splitters, front splitter and side panels as well. And then from there, looking at putting a Fast 102 manifold on the vehicle as well as a cam. So looking forward to those mods as well. So today we are going to be digging into these boxes and pulling out some of the stuff that we're going to need in order to do the water pump change. I will go step by step for you guys, so hopefully it's something that you can use as an instructional video if necessary. And with that, let's get on with the vlog. Hi guys, so we're going to need a couple things before we start. One, we are going to have to jack this vet up. Now I posted a previous video on how to jack up a Corvette, but I am actually not going to use my floor jack and jack stands this time, as I've ordered something that I think might be a little easier to get the car up and help us out a little bit in today's install. The Rhino ramps provide about 8 inches of lift off of either the front or the rear, depending on which side of the vehicle you're jacking up. But before we can have any fun doing installations today, I have got to get my Saturday chores done because the Commander-in-Chief of the house is expecting it. All right, all done. Let's have some fun. So we're going to need a couple things before we start. So here we go, guys. Number one, we're going to need a water pump, and number two, we're going to need the thermostat. So let's start unpacking. All right, from Summit Racing, where I ordered my thermostat from, it is a Lingenfilter 160-degree thermostat. As you can see right here, pretty simple, just your standard thermostat. What else we got in the box here? All right, sent some pretty cool stickers. Always good to have stickers. And most importantly is the new water pump, because the old one is broken. And here we go, guys. Here is the LS2 water pump with new gaskets. And this is what we're going to be installing today. So before we start, I want to go through a couple things that you're going to need beforehand, other than the water pump and the thermostat, which at least I'm putting in. And that is the tools that you're going to need in order to do a water pump installation on the C6 LS2. So number one, this is pretty simple stuff, guys. Now, I'm not a car mechanic by any means. As a matter of fact, I would say I'm extremely novice working my way around an engine. I think this is something that we can easily do in the garage. We're going to try it today, and you guys are going to come along with me. All right, so number one, 5/16 nut driver, and I've got that right here. You can see. By the way, the nut driver is so that we can take the air intake out, the upper radiator and lower radiator hoses. All right, the 15mm socket. This socket is going to be used to take off the belt tensioner. And we're going to need a 10mm deep socket and a 10mm short socket for removing the water pump. And I'll explain in a little while why we need both a deep and a short socket. All right, we're going to need needle nose vice grips, but I believe pliers will work in order to get the hoses off. And we are also going to need a torque wrench. And the reason we're going to need the torque wrench is because when we put the water pump bolts back in, we're going to have to tighten the water pump bolts first to 11 pounds. And then once all 6 bolts are tightened to 11 pounds, we'll go back and retighten to 22 pounds or 22 foot-pounds torque to get that properly seated per standard. I've got a couple extenders here just in case we need those. And guys, I think that's about it as far as the tools that you're going to need. So pretty simple. So there are a number of steps that are involved in replacing the water pump. I'm just going to summarize what those are at a very basic level for you right now. So if you haven't already removed the coolant out of your car, you're going to have to remove the coolant. Obviously recommended that you use a drain pan. To use a drain pan on a C6, it's best that you jack the car up a little bit, or drive the car up onto ramps or something similar, so that you can get some height under the car in order to get the drain pan down there, because most likely if you haven't drained your car already, or if you're low on coolant, you're going to get some spillage when you remove the radiator hoses. All right, so once the coolant is removed, then we are going to remove the air intake. Once the air intake is gone, we're going to remove the radiator hoses, and then we're going to take the belt off the belt tensioner, remove the belt tensioner, and then we're going to get in there and remove the lower radiator hoses before we take out the water pump. So once we got those hoses off, we're going to unbolt the water pump. We're going to clean and scrape where the gaskets were, so that when we put the new gaskets on, they seal nicely. And then we're basically going to prepare the new water pump for install, and then just reverse that whole process. So that's basically what it is today, guys. And as we go through here, I will put some words on the screen. You will see them, and then hopefully you'll be able to follow along a little better. So as you can see, we pulled the car up in on the Rhino ramps, which gives us about an extra 8 inches of clearance underneath the car, which is perfect for putting the drain pan under the car to catch any remaining coolant that might still be in the system. All right, guys, safety first. Always good to chock the rear wheels, especially if you have your car jacked up on a floor jack or jack stands or up on ramps. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the reservoir cap so that there is not any negative pressure in the reservoir as we go to drain any remaining coolant out of the bottom of the car. All right, so we're down here underneath the right front fender, and what you're looking at here is what's called the petcock valve. This just needs to be turned in order for the fluid to drain out of this hole right here, and that will get rid of any remaining coolant that we have in the system. So I'm going to go ahead and see if there's anything left to drain, and we'll move on to the next step. It looks as though the coolant line is pretty much drained. I'm going to go ahead and leave that catch pan down there, because as I begin removing the upper and lower radiator hoses, it's likely to drain more fluid down below. So we're going to move on to our next step, which is removing the cold air intake system. All right, guys, so step one after draining your coolant system is to remove the air intake. So we're going to use our 5/16 nut driver, and this is going to be used to do a couple things. One, we're going to remove the throttle body clamp right here and remove the air intake off the throttle body intake. We're also going to remove this electrical connector right here, as well as the vacuum line, which you see over here. And once those three things are removed, then we can pull out the air intake and we'll be ready to move on to step number 2. All right, guys, so step 1, we remove the air intake. So our next step is going to be removing the upper radiator hose. And you can see here, we'll be using the needle nose pliers on. We'll be clamping those together and trying to remove these radiator hoses. This car's got a good 80,000 miles on it, so these hoses, I don't know if they've ever been removed, but I have a feeling they may not want to come off as easily as I hoped, but we'll see how it goes. Nope. All right, there we go. Upper radiator hose has been removed. Next step is going to be to remove the belt that you see here from the belt tensioner. We're going to use our 15mm socket, and we are going to basically place the socket in here, push forward in order to, as you'll see there, loosen the tension on the tensioner, which will then allow us to take this belt off. just like that. Now here's what you want to be careful of. You want to make sure that the belt gets put back on the tensioner when we're done replacing the water pump exactly how it came off and is aligned correctly. All right, so for our next step, we are going to be using again the needle nose pliers to remove the lower radiator hose that you see right here. This will probably also be a bear to get off, but hopefully won't be too much of a problem. And then once we get that off, then we're going to remove the tensioner, and then after that we'll remove these two lower heater hoses. All right, so needle nose pliers don't work because vice grips are what we needed. So you can see the vice grips just hold the clamp down, and now next I am going to remove the heater hoses, the two that you see here. And then after that we will be removing the tensioner before taking the water pump out. All right, so our next step is we are going to remove the tensioner. And the tensioner has two bolts that we got to remove. It's going to be a 15 millimeter socket that we use, and they should come right out. And once the tensioner comes off, then we'll be ready to remove the water pump. Hydrate or die. And this, my friends, is why the deep socket works better than the short. All right, folks, and there you go. Just like with the other tensioner bolt, I can feel all that sticky coolant on there, which again leads me to believe that the water pump went bad. So here's our tensioner. So I will keep the bolts with it and place it over here with the air intake. We've got the air intake off. We've got the upper radiator hose, the lower radiator hose off. We've got the two heater hoses off and the tensioner off. Next is to unbolt the water pump, which we will do with a 10 millimeter socket. Now there are 6 bolts. They should be, at least according to the specs, they should be on there at 22 foot-pounds, which is why when we reverse this process, we will be using the torque wrench to ensure that we get them all on at 11 foot-pounds first and then 22 foot-pounds after that. So next step is to remove the 6 bolts holding the water pump in. All right, so here we have the old water pump removed. Gaskets actually look pretty good. Definitely an old water pump. However, we will see once we put the new one back on. And on the new water pump, we will install the new thermostat, which is a 160-degree thermostat. All right, well, major fail, guys. When installing the new thermostat into the new water pump, the 160-degree thermostat, I over-torqued the bolt and it popped off. So we are trying to figure out how to get this out so that we can use the bolts from the other water pump to secure the thermostat housing on. So not sure if we really screwed up here or if we're going to be able to fix this, but I'll let you know. All right, let us finally get on with the installation of the replacement LS2 water pump. Thank you again so much to Online Auto Parts Express for getting this new water pump back to us. We are going to complete the installation today, so let's unbox the new water pump. We will take off the thermostat housing, put the new 160-degree thermostat in, and get this new water pump installed. This is the thermostat housing. We're going to remove these 2 bolts, take the thermostat housing off, and replace it with the thermostat that we got here from Lingenfelter. All right, so let us take the thermostat housing off of the water pump. This is the 160-degree thermostat, and inside here is the OEM thermostat. So we are going to use a 10mm socket to remove the 2 bolts holding the thermostat housing onto the water pump. And here we go. So we just, easy as this, remove the old thermostat from the thermostat housing, take the new thermostat, line up the dimple on the O-ring gasket, just like that, and it goes right back on. Just start this out by hand tightening just to make sure I'm not cross-threading. And once I make sure these bolts are threaded properly, I'll go ahead and use the cordless ratchet and tighten these down. Alright folks, and there we go. We've got the new 160-degree thermostat installed in the thermostat housing on the water pump. Here is the old OEM, although it's brand new because it's never been used from this water pump. So PM me and let me know if this is something you want. 190-degree thermostat. Never been used. I will send it to the first person who PMs me that needs a thermostat. It's yours. So the new thermostat came with brand new gaskets, which obviously go between the water pump and the engine block to help seal the coolant fluid. So what I want to do at this point is I want to take and clean the engine block where the gaskets are going to sit. I've already done a little bit of work here, but you can see right here there's some residue right around where that gasket O-ring is going to sit. And I want to make sure that's all nice and clean, just so that we get a good seal. So one way to do that is to use a razor blade and some like carb cleaner once you scrape away some of the residue off of there, just to make sure that it's nice and clean for a good seal on that new gasket. We'll simply take a razor blade here, and we're just gonna take off that old residue. It's fairly simple. You just got to be able to get your arms in here and then get in here and just clean it off. So you want to do that on both sides where the water pump gaskets are going to sit. So you can see here that's pretty clean, and then back up under here as well. So now that we have cleaned the contact surface on the engine block where the new gaskets are going to be seated against the engine block and the water pump to ensure a good seal, what we want to do now is we want to prep the water pump for installation back onto the engine block. And the way we do that, it's fairly simple. We're going to take the original 6 bolts that held the original OEM water pump on. I'm going to clean these up just a little bit. I'm just going to use that gum out and just kind of make sure these threads are cleaned up. And then what we're going to do is we're going to install each of these bolts back into the 6 respective holes where the bolts go, like this. And then before we actually do the install, we're going to take the gasket and we're going to preset the gasket over the bolts so that when we place the water pump back into the engine bay, we don't have to be fumbling around with these. These will already be preset on the water pump and ready to seat tightly against the engine block. Replace the bolts back into the water pump, and the gaskets just go right here over the bolts. And then you can see I've already placed this gasket on here. We're going to take this water pump now and put it back into the engine bay, and we will be bolting the water pump back onto the engine block with the gaskets preset. You want to make sure you do that, especially if you're doing this with one person. So what I'm looking to do now is kind of hand tighten a little bit just to make sure I'm not cross threading. All right, so I'm able to get those in pretty easy with my hand. So like I said, what we're trying to do is, one, keep from cross threading because you don't want to mess the bolts up. Number two, what we're also trying to do is get this evenly set with each of the 6 bolts. So OEM specs on this are 11 foot-pounds of torque for the initial tightening of all 6, and then once all 6 are done, then you want to go back and retighten each of the 6 bolts to 22 foot-pounds of torque, and that will be seated on at spec. So that's what we're going to do. All right, so now we're going to use the 10mm socket. So this is that new Milwaukee M12 lithium cordless ratchet. I believe it's rated to like 35 pounds of torque. This just helps me. Obviously, it's a little more efficient than sticking a manual ratchet down in there. Quickly tighten each one of these. Good news is this thing's got a light on it, which is money. All right, so we've got the water pump bolted back on. I don't know how many foot-pounds of torque each of these are. I do know they're on there pretty solid, so I am going to use my torque wrench here set at 22 pounds just to make sure that those are seated to OEM spec, and then we will be good to go to finish this install. All right, so at this point we have the water pump installed. The bolts are now tightened down to 20 foot-pounds of torque. The next step is we are going to be reattaching the 2 heater hoses down here on the lower part of the water pump. After that, we're going to attach the lower radiator hose right here. We're going to get the tensioner, belt tensioner back on. We'll reinstall the upper radiator hose. Reattach a couple little hoses up here as part of the coolant system that I had to remove just to give me some room, and then we're going to put the air intake back on to the manifold, and at that point we will refill the coolant system with new coolant and we should be good to go. So let's move on. All right, so now we are going to reattach the 2 heater hoses. In this case I like to use vice grips. I'm going to try and do this with just regular old needle nose pliers. There's one. And there's 2. All right, so the lower heater hoses are back on. Next is going to be replace the lower radiator hose. Now, you can see on this one, on some vets, you have the 5/16 little nut clamp that holds on the radiator hose. This is just a pinch clamp. Just know that if you don't have this tension clamp right here, you may have to use your 5/16 nut driver. So we are losing a little bit of light in here, mainly because it's getting really dark out here. We've got some storms moving into the area, which is a welcome sight for us as it has not rained very much. You can hear the thunder in the background. Lower radiator hose is on. We will unclamp and we should be good to go. Okay, so the next step is to reattach the tensioner that you can see here. It's awfully dirty. I am going to actually take just a little bit of time here and try and clean this up a little bit since I have it off. And once it's cleaned up, we're going to reinstall the tensioner back here onto the water pump and get the belt reconnected so that we can get this project done. So for the belt tensioner, we are going to be using the 15mm socket. All right, here we go. And like with all the other components here, I'm just going to hand tighten the first few threads just to make sure we're not cross-threading. We're good to go. By the way, if you don't have one of these cordless ratchets, I recommend them. They're fantastic. Make things a lot easier. We've got the belt tensioner back on. Now it is time to put the belt back on. Now this is an important step because we've got to make sure that the belt is fed back exactly the way it was before we took it off, for obvious reasons. So I'm going to take a look down here and just make sure everything's back on track, and then when it is, what we are going to do is take our 15mm socket. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our 15mm socket, we're just going to crank forward on the tensioner, put the belt back on, and release. It's that simple. All right, so at this point, here's what we got left. We've got the upper radiator hose that needs to be reattached here. And then from there, if I remember correctly, it is just the air intake, and we will be done. And we'll be ready to fill her up with coolant and give her a little test run. So right now, I am going to reattach the upper radiator hose. So we're all set to go here. I am going to double check all of the hoses and double check the belt just to make sure everything's back where it should be, and then I'm going to put the air intake back on, and once the air intake's back on, we should be good to go to fill this baby up with coolant and get her cranked up. So at this point, we have reinstalled the water pump, the hoses, the belt back on the belt tensioner, and we have gotten the air filter back in place. I have an air raid, cold air intake. So reattach the electrical line and the vacuum line as well. We've got the tensioner cinched down onto the throttle body. So we should be good to go with this install. Okay, now for the last couple steps here, we are going to flush the radiator a couple times. I don't believe it's that dirty. We're going to find out. So here's basically what we're going to do. So now that we have the new water pump installed, we have gotten the air intake put back on, everything's ready to go. I'm going to do a flush and clean real quick with Prestone Flush and Cleaner. So what this is going to do is it's going to get the thermostat, the 160-degree thermostat that we just installed. It's going to open up, it's going to allow the flushing cleaner and the water that we put into the coolant system right now to kind of cycle through the engine, clean out any remaining or residual coolant that was in there from before. Then we're going to shut the vehicle off, let it cool completely down, and then we're going to drain the entire system again. And then we're going to fill it back up with water, run it again for about 10 minutes with the heater on full blast in the car. After about 8 to 10 minutes of that, assuming the coolant system is working, we'll shut it off, let it cool, drain the entire system of that, and then the last step will be to fill up the coolant system through the overflow reservoir with Prestone 5050 coolant. And at that point, we should be good to go. We'll check for any leaks, and that should be the end of the project. So I'll take you through a couple of these steps on this video, so enjoy it, and here we go. And it's been so long since we've run the Vette because we waited 2 weeks for the water pump. The battery is run down, so I'm going to charge the battery. The water pump didn't blow up, so that's a good sign. So you can see in here the coolant level is at the top of the reservoir, but as the car runs and the coolant starts cycling through the system, especially when that thermostat opens up at 160 degrees, that water level is going to drop. And so I got the hose here to kind of fill it up and get the system filled so that we can flush it. Let the car run for about 10 minutes at temperature, and then we're going to let the car completely cool down, and then we're going to flush the system. So the water heater right now, it just reached 160 degrees, so I expect the thermostat to start opening up and cycling water through, so we'll keep an eye on this gauge as it climbs up to about 170 right now. So I am going to turn the heater on full as they recommended. So we'll crank the heater up to 90 degrees, and we'll continue to watch the thermostat gauge here. That definitely isn't climbing any higher. So as I turn the heater on and get this coolant, actually just water with the additive, cycling through the system, I expect that to begin to drop down. So we'll keep an eye on it. All right guys, the install and replacement of the LS2 water pump is complete. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please give it a big thumbs up, and if this is your first time visiting the channel, please subscribe. This is Kevin with Hooked on Vets. Have a blessed day.
Subscribe to Hooked on Vets today.